Daughter of Xanadu is a story of Emmajin, who is athletic, strong-willed. She's a 16-year-old girl who is a granddaughter of Khubilai Khan in the time of the Mongol Empire, which was the 13th century. And she wants to do something that no other woman or girl had ever done in those days, which is to join the Mongol army, to become a warrior. And she's very determined to do this. And then she meets a man named Marco Polo, who is witty and charming and just the exact opposite of the men that she knows in the Mongol army, and just the exact opposite of what she wants to be in her life. And that's where it starts. Well, when Marco Polo went to China, which was 1275 AD, China was not ruled by Chinese emperors. It was ruled by a Mongol or Mongolian emperor. It was part of the Mongol Empire. It was the capital, and the ruler was Khubilai Khan, and he was the most powerful emperor in the world. And the reason was that his grandfather, Genghis Khan, had united this disparate group of nomadic horsemen, and they had galloped to the west and conquered all of Central Asia and gone even as far as Europe. And in those days, Europe was fairly backward, and actually China was much more wealthy and civilized and powerful than Europe was. And by the time Marco got there, most of the warfare had stopped, and Khubilai Khan was ruling over the largest empire in history. A lot of people think Marco Polo was a famous explorer, and that's what they hear about when they learn about him in school. The interesting thing, I think, is that he really wasn't so much an explorer. He went to China before most Europeans had ever been there, but he went with his father and uncle who had already been there. He was only 17 years old when he left Venice to go to China. Marco Polo's book, he talks about Khubilai Khan. He talks about meeting Khubilai Khan, and as far as we know, he did in fact meet Khubilai Khan and actually worked for him. But in his book, he mentions that when he got to China, he was 21 years old. When he left China, he was 38. That's kind of unusual. We think of traveling merchants as moving around a lot. But he never mentions in his book anything about a love affair. If you know anything about men between the age of 21 and 38, I think you'll think, well, maybe there was something that he didn't write about in his book. So that's where my imagination came in. There were no European women in China at that time, so it would have been an Asian woman. So the main character in this book is an Asian woman, Emmajin, and the story is told from her point of view, which is very different from the kind of history that we usually get, which is from the European male point of view. Marco Polo really looked and acted in very startling ways to Emmajin and the rest of the Mongols, because he was one of the very first Europeans to show up at the court of Khubilai Khan. He and his father and uncle were probably the first, as far as we know. And Mongolians and Chinese are similar in appearance in that they have usually black hair, dark eyes. The men have thin beards, if any beards at all. And Europeans to them looked hairy. They often had very thick beards. And in Marco's case, he had sort of reddish brown hair that was curly, and his eyes were kind of greenish. The idea of people with green and blue eyes was just very strange to the Mongols. The other thing was the way he acted. The Mongol men that Emmajin knew were tough guys, and Marco was charming, he was witty, he was very good with words. In fact, Khubilai Khan decided that he wanted Marco to tell him stories. He was so good with words. Even though he wasn't a native speaker of Mongolian, he had to learn how to speak Mongolian. And he told stories about romance and courtly love, things like that. And Emmajin had never heard anyone talk that way. And it was very appealing. Emmajin really was torn between her feelings for Marco and her sense of loyalty to her family. In fact, this was a really central conflict for her in this book. Her family had certain expectations of her, and they wanted her initially they wanted her to get married, but they certainly, when she joined the army, they had an expectation that she would be a warrior. And Marco Polo was not a warrior. He was a foreigner. He was a merchant. He was not from a royal or even an aristocratic family, so he was what we would call low class today. He was totally inappropriate. He was the wrong guy to fall in love with. This was definitely a forbidden love affair that should never have happened. And she was torn not just between what her family expected, but between her attraction for Marco and her own dreams for what she wanted for herself, which was to gain the respect of the people around her. I think girls today and young women really can relate to Emmajin. And the reason is, there are two reasons. One is that the conflict between what your family expects of you and your own personal dreams. I think many young women face this, particularly as they get on with their careers. There are certain things their family wants them to do, and then there are things that they really dream that they would love to do. Many young women face that conflict themselves. I've been fascinated with China for a long time, but I grew up in Ohio, far from any foreign countries, but I was fascinated with foreign countries, foreign languages, foreign cultures, and I really wanted to travel someday. When I was in high school, I went to France, I learned French, and then after college, I moved to Singapore and studied Chinese and taught English and got to travel all around Asia. Just fell in love with Asia. But in those days, you could not go to China if you were an American. So I had to wait for a while. I was training to be a journalist, so my big dream was to combine journalism with my interest in China. And I wanted to be a foreign correspondent in China. And I was able to do that. I was very lucky because China opened up to American journalists right about that time. And I joined Business Week. And within a year and a half, they sent me to Hong Kong to cover China. So ever since that time, I've just been really fascinated with China. Traveling to research this story was one of the best things about writing this book. I got a chance to go to Mongolia twice, Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia. Also went to the Silk Road and to southwest China. In Mongolia, I got to stay in a Mongolian yurt, which they call a ger, but it's the rounded tent that we all know about, and to practice archery and ride on horses and ride on camels. That was really fun. But the most amazing thing in the traveling was to go to Xanadu. The title of the book, Daughter of Xanadu, comes because Xanadu is not some made-up fantastical world, which is usually what most of us think when we hear the word Xanadu. It actually was a real place. It was the summer palace of Khubilai Khan. And Marco Polo, we believe, really did go there. And there is a place 200 miles north of Beijing where Xanadu used to stand, but it is totally in ruins now. It is not on any tourist itinerary. It is very hard to find, but a friend and I figured out how to get there, and it was a real thrill to get there, and even though it's just in ruins, to just see the lay of the land and where the gardens and the palace of Xanadu really stood. There's a story in this book about searching for dragons. The animals that they were searching for were actually crocodiles, we believe. And that comes from Marco Polo's own book. He has a chapter in his book about searching for what he calls serpents. And he describes them as scaly, long, low to the ground, with sharp claws, big teeth. And he describes a crocodile almost perfectly. And he talks about how the local people in southwest China go to hunt these things. And I just thought that was fascinating, so I included that in the book. I got very interested in this period of history as I was doing the research for this book. And I came to the conclusion that this period of time, the 13th century, was a turning point in history. Because before this, Asia had always been more powerful than Europe, or had been for hundreds of years. More powerful, more wealthy, more advanced, more civilized than Europe. Don't forget, Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages and then the Middle Ages. It was the High Middle Ages. They were building Gothic cathedrals, but it still was not a very advanced civilization the way we know Europe to be. And at the time Marco Polo went, Asia was at the peak of its power. Well, what happened was, although we think of Mongols as being very warlike, after they conquered all of Central Asia, from China all the way to Europe, they enforced the peace. So there was a period of almost 100 years when it was possible to travel from Europe to China safely. That was the first time in history anybody could do that. It was right around the time of Marco Polo. That's why he was one of the first people from Europe to go to China. He was one of the first who could. And because you could travel safely between Europe and Asia, a lot of the ideas from China came to Europe. A lot of the inventions, a lot of the technology. This reading is from later in the book. All 12,000 of us Mongol soldiers watched in shocked silence as a massive army of elephants crested the hill and advanced. The ground under our feet shook from their stomping. If their intent was to instill fear, they succeeded. I tried to control the dread swelling in my gut, but I had never felt so overwhelmed. By the time the thundering stopped, more than 2,000 elephants, all equipped for war, had marched into the plain of Vochan. How the king of Burma had achieved such a feat was a mystery. I could not believe that so many of these giant creatures existed in the whole world. A scout returned, and I crowded with the other soldiers to hear his breathless report. They're large and fearsome, the largest beasts in the world, he said. Each one carries on its back a fortress of wood, well-framed and strong, full of archers. At least 12, maybe 16 archers on each elephant, all well-armed. I quickly calculated. The archers on elephant back alone far outnumbered our 12,000 soldiers, and that was only 1/3 the number of troops the king of Burma had brought to Vochan. All told, there were indeed 60,000 Burmese troops. They outnumbered us 5 to 1.